by scratching the surface, you get a terrible shock. It's it's a heinous crime. People are so shocked by.
The announcement had barely been made before the atmosphere inside the palace shifted completely. One unexpected decision had changed the future of the monarchy. William stood facing a responsibility he had spent his life preparing for, while Camilla struggled to hide the shock written across her face. What should have been a controlled moment became personal within seconds, because the Privy Council had not discussed succession. It had formally recognized William as king, forcing Charles to confront a reality he had imagined would arrive much later. But the story was what happened behind that decision, and why Camilla reacted so strongly. Before we uncover what happened inside the palace, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William did not react the way anyone expected. He remained still for several seconds, looking toward Charles as the meaning of the declaration settled over the room. The council had not simply announced another stage in the succession. In this dramatized scenario, it had placed the crown within William's immediate reach, and every person present understood that the old order had changed. Charles kept his eyes on the papers in front of him. He had signed them willingly, yet the silence around that signature felt heavier than any ceremony. Camilla was the first to move. She stepped backward, reached for the nearest chair, and asked whether the decision was already final. No one answered quickly enough. That hesitation told her everything. The transition had already begun, and there was no simple way to stop it. William finally looked at his father. He expected regret, perhaps hesitation, but Charles offered neither. Instead, the former king told him that authority was not something a person could hold forever simply because surrendering it was painful. William understood the words, but understanding them did not make the moment easier. He had spent his entire life preparing for responsibility while secretly imagining that his father would remain at the center for many more years. Now that future had disappeared in a single announcement. Camilla watched the two men in silence. Her concern was no longer only about her own position. She feared that Charles had accepted a decision whose emotional cost would become impossible to reverse. The first signs of change appeared almost immediately. Senior officials began redirecting briefings toward William's office. Documents that once required Charles's approval were placed before the new king instead. Staff members spoke more carefully, as though everyone was learning where authority now belonged. William noticed every adjustment. He understood that a crown could change hands publicly in minutes, but an institution needed thousands of smaller decisions to recognize the new center of power. That realization made the situation feel more serious, not less. He asked one official how long the preparations had been underway. The answer was vague, but it confirmed what William had begun to suspect. Charles had been preparing quietly for longer than anyone had admitted. Camilla soon discovered a detail that made the situation even more painful. A document connected to the transition carried Charles's signature from several days earlier. She stared at the date and realized the declaration had not been an impulsive decision. Something had happened before the council meeting. Something had convinced Charles that waiting would create more instability than moving forward. She demanded to know what had changed his mind, but the officials would not discuss private conversations. That silence only deepened her suspicion. William saw the document later and recognized that his father had deliberately kept him outside the final preparations. The new king was unsettled by that choice. He could not tell whether Charles had protected him or simply decided that no one should interfere. By evening, the palace had divided into two realities. Outside, the public waited for confirmation and celebration. Inside, three people were trying to understand what the new order meant for their lives. William had the crown, Charles had lost it, and Camilla was watching the structure around both men change before her eyes. Yet the most important question remained unanswered. Why had Charles chosen this moment to let go? The answer, William realized, would determine whether the transition became a peaceful handover or the beginning of a deeper family conflict. The silence made everyone understand nothing inside the palace would ever return to normal again. The meeting took place privately, away from advisors and cameras, because everyone involved understood that the subject could not be discussed publicly without creating panic. Camilla challenged the timetable first. She believed William's responsibilities were expanding too quickly and argued that Charles needed more time before surrendering authority. Her concern was not presented as opposition to William personally. She described it as protection for a man who had waited decades to become king and might not be emotionally prepared to step away. Charles listened until she finished. Then he asked whether she was protecting him or protecting the life she had become accustomed to living beside him. The question silenced the room. Camilla insisted that those things were not separate. If Charles lost his position, she argued, their entire household would change with it. Charles did not disagree. He simply said that the monarchy could not remain suspended between generations because the family feared the consequences of choosing one future over another. His words made clear that he had already begun thinking beyond his own reign. William was brought into the conversation near the end. He immediately recognized that the disagreement had become personal. Camilla told him the transition was moving too quickly. William answered that he had never demanded the crown early and would not pretend to control a decision that belonged to his father. He turned toward Charles and asked him to make the choice himself, without allowing either son or wife to become responsible for the consequences. Charles said nothing, but the request stayed with him after the meeting ended. Later that night, Charles reviewed the documents that would allow the transition to move forward. He knew that signing them would close the door on the argument. He also knew that delaying again would invite another round of negotiations. For years, he had imagined succession as something that happened naturally at the end of a long reign. Now he saw that uncertainty itself had become a source of tension. William was increasingly prepared to carry greater responsibilities. Camilla was increasingly determined to protect Charles from surrendering them. The longer the situation continued, the harder it became to keep both sides satisfied. Charles made the decision alone. He authorized the next stage without telling William the final timing and without giving Camilla another opportunity to reopen the debate. His reasoning was simple. If the transfer was going to happen, it had to happen cleanly. No one could claim that William had pressured him. No one could say Camilla had been given too little warning to object. And no advisor could be blamed for a choice that belonged to the monarch himself. By the following morning, the machinery of succession was already moving. When Camilla discovered what had happened, her reaction was immediate. She confronted Charles privately and asked why he had kept the final date from her. He told her that he had not hidden it because he distrusted her. He had hidden it because he knew she loved him enough to fight the decision. That answer hurt more than an accusation could have. Camilla realized that her strongest argument had become the very reason Charles believed she could not be included. William learned about the confrontation later. He did not celebrate his father's decision. Instead, he became concerned about what the secrecy had done to the family. He knew Camilla felt betrayed, while Charles seemed determined not to revisit the choice. William decided that his first responsibility was not to defend his new authority. It was to prevent the transfer from becoming a permanent wound between them. The next meeting between William and Camilla carried that tension into the open. She was recovering away from the main palace rooms when he entered without advisors. Neither spoke immediately. William could have approached her as the new sovereign, but he deliberately avoided doing so. He asked whether she believed he had wanted Charles removed from the center. Camilla admitted that she feared the new order had been designed around William and Catherine long before Charles was ready to accept it. William denied that accusation. Catherine had not known the final date, he explained, and he had not asked Charles to surrender anything. The decision had been his father's alone. Camilla struggled with that answer because it removed the person she had expected to blame. William then told her that protecting Charles was understandable, but deciding how long Charles was allowed to remain king was not her decision to make. The words were calm, yet they exposed the boundary she had crossed. Camilla finally admitted that fear had influenced her actions. She had watched Charles spend a lifetime waiting for the crown, and the thought of seeing him surrender it terrified her. William listened and acknowledged that he understood the fear. He also admitted that becoming king had not felt like victory. It felt like inheriting a responsibility created by his father's sacrifice. For the first time, the two stopped arguing about procedure and began speaking about the people underneath the titles. He explained that he had chosen the transfer because he believed uncertainty was becoming more damaging than change. He did not want William to spend years waiting for permission to lead, nor did he want his own desire to remain king to become an obstacle to the monarchy's future. He told Camilla that surrendering the crown did not mean surrendering his identity, and he told William that accepting authority did not mean abandoning his father. That conversation changed the atmosphere. Camilla did not suddenly approve of everything, but she stopped demanding that the transition be reversed. William promised that her personal place beside Charles would not be treated as an enemy position. Her institutional influence would change because the crown had changed, but she would not be humiliated for having resisted. Charles remained firm. The decision was final, yet the family could choose what happened after it. The palace then began adjusting in ways that no speech could hide. Meetings were redirected. Briefings moved toward William. Staff waited for his approval. Camilla noticed that invitations once handled through her office now required clearance from the new king. Each change was small, but together they showed that authority had moved. Charles understood the pain those changes caused, but he refused to interfere. He believed that revering William's decisions on the first day would weaken the new reign before it had begun. William made one unexpected instruction. He told senior staff that institutional changes must never become personal punishment. Camilla's team was to be treated with respect, and no one was to use the transition as an excuse for humiliation. The order surprised her because she had expected retaliation. Instead, William had chosen restraint. That decision did not erase their disagreement, but it gave both of them a reason to lower their defenses. Outside the palace, the public story was becoming larger. Charles's decision was analyzed, and Camilla's reaction became part of the day's defining images. Yet the deeper story was not simply that one king had replaced another. It was that a family had been forced to confront the cost of succession while the entire country watched. Charles had surrendered power by choice. William had accepted it with hesitation. Camilla had resisted because she feared what would disappear. The final truth was impossible to ignore. For William, the crown became a responsibility he could no longer postpone. For Charles, letting go became the deepest sacrifice of his reign. For Camilla, resistance slowly gave way to understanding. The monarchy had changed in a single moment, but the family behind it had to live with the consequences. Britain had not witnessed a transfer of power. It had watched one generation step aside so another could lead with purpose, restraint, and duty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.